Hunger and thirst, the paradigmatic structure of desire by Vibhita. āhāre paṭikūlasaññā bhikkhave, bhavita bahulikata, mahaphalla hoti maha nisangsa, amato gadha amata pariyosanati. When the perception of the repulsiveness of food is developed and cultivated, it's very fruitful and beneficial. It has freedom from death as its objective and culmination. Anguttara Nikaya. One way to approach this contemplation is through the phenomenological examination of hunger and thirst, an example which is illustrative of the basic structure of all craving. Discern the other side of eating. The pleasure of food is structurally dependent upon the pain of hunger. It gains its affective force from the discomfort of hunger and is able to proliferate on that basis. Eating, drinking, and digestion produce milder discomforts that distract away from the greater underlying pangs of hunger, analogous to how the milder pain of scratching distracts from the greater underlying pain of the itch. Eating consists of bodily exertion, pressure, fullness, swallowing, digestive activity, etc. Sensations normally interpreted positively because they participate in the removal of the more urgent discomfort of hunger. They are simply milder discomforts that are transformed in lived apprehension by the contrasting background pain of hunger. That structural dependence means that the pleasure of food can never escape the horizon of underlying pain established by hunger and thirst. In other words, pleasure and pain are not separate elements contained in sense objects that are somehow made available to the subject through the act of consumption. The pain of eating becomes clearer during times of illness or prolonged fasting, when the taxing nature of consumption becomes more conspicuous against the background of bodily weakness. It is quickly forgotten when health is restored, and it becomes easier to relish the prospect of eating normally again. The bodily cycle of hunger, eating, and temporary satiation, followed by renewed desire for food, discloses the general structure of craving. Felt inadequacy turns into appropriative desire, which turns outward to desirable objects as sources of temporary relief. Gratification does provide relief, but in turn further entrenches the subject in the need to gratify as the presumed solution to inadequacy. The subject may seek to increase the frequency, intensity, and proliferation of mental desires in order to achieve the same level of relief as the prior instance of gratification. Alternatively, that reinforcement may manifest as the temporary deferring of gratification, to allow the increased discomfort of privation to heighten the perception of pleasure during the eventual moment of indulgence. Whatever the means, gratification cannot ever actually resolve this inadequacy, and that is why it is so effective as a self-perpetuating positive feedback loop. We keep looking for the lost keys beneath the street lamp because that is where the light happens to be. And so the search can go on indefinitely and even be delighted in as a kind of illusory, goal-oriented play or adventure. The turn away from greater pain and misperception of distracting lesser pain as pleasure is felt pleasure as such. Hunger makes this structure especially conspicuous, but all forms of craving, from the pleasure of scenery to sexual intercourse, follow this paradigm. At the immediate level, restlessness might give beautiful sights their affective force. The pleasure of sexual union provides relief against the background pain of lust, and in many cases, loneliness and the desire for recognition. At a more fundamental level, conditioned lived experience is pervaded by duḥkha, or existential unease, an underlying instability rooted in impermanence and the corollary inadequacy of conditioned existence. Any sensual distraction that makes you lose sight of that broader context is felt as a relief. Desire, therefore, does not begin with the pleasurable object. It begins with an inadequacy in the present condition. The desired object subsequently appears as positively valuable because it promises release from that inadequacy. An ignorant assumption regarding the nature of pleasure, Kāmupādāna, the assumption of sensuality following Hillside Hermitage, underpins the whole mechanism. We assume that pleasure is contained in sense objects and is therefore somehow outside the context of underlying pain. Sense restraint, moderation in eating, and embodied contemplation can be employed as gradual means of uprooting this assumption and short-circuiting the cycle of self-reinforcement. Things to keep in mind while consuming food, whether tasty or disgusting. Eat simple food for nutrition and sustenance. Eat only to live. Live only to practice dharma. Practice only for liberation, not for psychological management and coping. Contemplate the conditioned and burdensome aspects of the pleasure of eating, its dependence upon hunger and thirst, before, during, and after, in order to overcome elation at the prospect of enjoying tasty meals. With sensual pleasure, pain precedes, pain pervades, pain persists, not necessarily as acute suffering, but as the pressure of lack before gratification, the bodily burden accompanying it, and the reoccurrence of pressuring need afterward. Pleasure never leaves the horizon of underlying pain. While the necessity of eating cannot be done away with through ascetic-contemplative practices, the craving for and dependence upon tastes can be eliminated. Rather than continually managing pressure by gratification, weaken the appropriation and craving that convert objects into promises of relief. Embodied contemplation of eating before, during, and after. Before, craving, anticipation, salivation, mental proliferation. The arising of perceived lack and the prospect of eliminating that lack and associated pain. During, chewing, swallowing, transient taste sensations, diminishing hunger, which in turn diminishes the pleasure of food being consumed, taxing bodily exertion. After, fullness, digestion, disappearance of pleasure, renewed hunger later. Each instance of anticipated pleasure and unreflective gratification deepens the dependency on tastes. Defecation and urination illustrate the pressure and release mechanism with particular transparency, but they generally entail far less anticipatory craving and mental proliferation than the desires associated with taste and the consumption of food.